You know, we often think history is made in these big, loud moments, right? But what if some really fundamental changes started? Well, quietly, almost behind the scenes.
That's often where the really interesting stuff happens.
Exactly. And today, we're doing a deep dive into this document from 1934. It's the report of the Commission on the Social Studies. And honestly, it might reveal some pretty surprising things about how modern American education got started.
Oh, definitely. It's kind of a forgotten blueprint, you could say, but with potentially huge implications.
Huge is right. And this wasn't just some random committee, was it?
Not at all. I mean, you had major figures from places like Columbia, Harvard, University of Chicago, Minnesota. It was sponsored by the American Historical Association, funded by the Carnegie Corporation.
So the intellectual heavyweights of the time.
Pretty much, yeah. Their job was essentially to map out the future of social studies education for the entire country.
And we're not talking small changes here. This was a 5-year study, and they were proposing a major overhaul of American education.
A fundamental reshaping, really.
So our goal today is to unpack their main ideas, especially their thinking about how the American economy was changing and how schools could maybe shape society.
The potential for social transformation, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all in there.
Right. We've waded through this massive report so you don't have to pull out the absolute key stuff, the really surprising bits, and maybe understand why certain educational ideas stick around.
Okay, so where shall we start? Maybe with the Commission's mandate. What they were actually set up to do.
Good idea, because they said themselves they were looking beyond just, textbooks and what subjects to teach.
Right. They explicitly mentioned considering the condition and prospects of the American people as a part of Western civilization now merging into a world order.
Wow. Okay. So, big picture thinking, not just classroom stuff.
Definitely. They were looking at America's place in the world, how things were changing globally.
And they used what they called the scientific method to do their research.
They did. And they applied it really broadly. They looked into teaching methods, tests, how teachers were trained, the school's role in the community.
So all the practical education things.
Yes, but also bigger societal trends, the nature of social sciences themselves, different social philosophies that were popular back in the 30s. They even used research from President Hoover's Committee on Social Trends.
Okay, so they were definitely thorough. They looked at the whole context of American society then.
Absolutely. But here's a really crucial point. While they valued that scientific approach, they knew it had limits.
Limits? How so?
They actually stated that the scientific method alone cannot in itself dictate purpose, policy, or program for either statecraft or education.
Ah, okay. So data is important, but it doesn't tell you what to do, basically.
Exactly. They knew that their recommendations involved making choices, judgments based on ethics, on aesthetics, alongside the facts. It wasn't just neutral reporting. They had a vision.
A vision for where America should be heading?
Precisely. And that vision really comes through when you look at their frame of reference.
Their frame of reference, what do they mean by that?
These were the fundamental conditions they saw in American life that they thought social studies absolutely had to deal with.
Okay, so what were these conditions?
Well, one of the biggest trends they pointed to was this move towards closer national unification, greater interdependence in the economy and social life and culture, everything becoming more connected.
Right, the country becoming more integrated.
Yeah, and they linked that directly to what they perceived as a waning of popular faith in economic individualism.
Less faith in individualism, meaning people were questioning pure capitalism.
Sort of, yeah. Questioning pure laissez-faire. They saw a growing demand from the public for more planning, more control in the economy, less of the idea the government should just keep its hands off.
Okay, and this led them somewhere significant.
It led them to a really major conclusion. Remember this in 1934, deep in the Depression. They stated, and this is a direct quote, "The age of individualism and laissez-faire in economy and government is closing, and that a new age of collectivism is emerging in the United States."
Wow.
Okay.
A new age of collectivism, that is.
Yeah.
That's a bombshell for 1934.
It really is. They saw the Depression as proof that unchecked individualism had failed, and something more collective was coming next. This wasn't just suggesting small fixes.
They thought the whole individualistic era was over, but were they clear on what collectivism actually meant? Like state control?
They admitted there was uncertainty about the exact form. Would it be public ownership? Changes to private property? They weren't totally sure. But they were convinced that the integrated economy they were seeing was a forerunner of a consciously integrated society, a society where individual economic choices and even property rights would be Well, altered. Abridged was the word they used.
Abridged. Changed. Okay. And they saw tension there, right? Between this trend and older American values.
Definitely. They pointed out the tensions, poverty next to wealth, inequality arising from this clash between the move towards collectivism and the traditional focus on the individual.
So if they saw this trend towards integration happening, what kind of future did they actually want? What were the desirable outcomes for them?
Well, within that big trend, they saw different paths possible, but they laid out what they thought was desirable. Things like using resources efficiently, better living standards for everyone, not just a few.
Okay.
Making culture more accessible to the masses, and curbing what they called acquisitive individualism.
Acquisitive individualism. So like the constant drive just to get more money and stuff.
Pretty much, yeah. That focus on personal wealth above all else. But, and this is important, they didn't want total conformity.
Right. They weren't pushing for like a dictatorship.
No, they explicitly said they wanted to avoid goose-step regimentation in thinking and culture. They wanted to keep room for individual expression, just maybe not so much in the purely economic sphere. And they stressed keeping the historic principles and ideals of American democracy alive, even within this more integrated society they envisioned.
So it's a tricky balance they were aiming for, kind of a blend of collectivism and democracy.
That seems to be the idea. More economic and social planning, dealing with societal problems collectively, but trying to hold on to democratic values and individual freedom in other areas.
Interesting. What else did they see as desirable?
They really emphasized the need for the public to have accurate knowledge, informed opinions about what was happening, and an enlightened attitude towards international relations to nationalism based on reason, not aggression.
Curbing economic expansionism, maybe.
Exactly. Limiting that. And they pushed for keeping the spirit of science, scholarship, freedom of thought, and studying diverse ideas, even controversial ones.
So they wanted education to bring in all these ideals, the best plans for the future.
Yes, that was the goal. To weave the best plans and ideals for the future of society and of the individual right into social science teaching.
Okay, so we have their view of society changing, their vision for the future. How did this translate into what they thought education should be doing? What was its purpose?
Well, their basic premise was that education always reflects some social philosophy. It's never neutral. It always involves choices about what's good for society and individuals.
Right.
And since they believed society was moving from individualism towards a more collective economy, they argued education had to get on board with this emerging integrated order.
Get on board or what?
Or make things worse. They basically laid out a choice. Education could keep stressing individualism, which they thought would just increase social tensions, or it could align with this integrated society idea and, ease the transition, help people adapt.
And they picked a side.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They chose the road they thought would lead to fulfilling American democratic ideals under these new conditions.
And they were specific about the kind of economy schools should prepare kids for.
Very specific. They explicitly endorsed an economy managed in the interests of the masses, as distinguished from any class or bureaucracy.
Managed for the masses. Okay, so schools should encourage what? Less focus on getting rich.
Essentially, yeah. Develop social and creative impulses more than the purely acquisitive ones. Equip the next generation to understand and, importantly, manage this integrated society.
Manage it. That's interesting.
And they wanted to bring all those ideals we mentioned, scientific, intellectual, ethical, aesthetic, right into the curriculum. They called for a big, increased emphasis on social science instruction because the times were so complex and critical.
Which sounds kind of familiar, actually. Lots of talk today about needing more civics and critical thinking.
It does resonate, doesn't it? This idea that understanding society is crucial.
So if that was the goal, how did they propose actually changing what was taught? The curriculum, the materials.
They called the selection of content the heart of the educational problem. And they said it always reflects your frame of reference, your basic assumptions about society.
Right. Your viewpoint shapes what you choose to teach.
Exactly. And they saw the social sciences as key here, providing knowledge, methods, showing society's goals, facts about social problems, trends for predicting the future, ethical ideals, and showing how that frame of reference itself shapes the curriculum.
Did they have principles for choosing this content?
Yes, 5 main ones. The purpose of education, the child's abilities, time available, the local community, and the teacher's professional duties.
Okay.
And they restated the great purpose of public schools. preparing youth for this complex, industrial, democratic society that was moving towards a cooperative and integrated economy needing planning.
And social sciences shouldn't be taught in a bubble, right?
Definitely not. They pushed for integrating it with other subjects for a more unified view of life. They wanted a coherent program from kindergarten all the way through junior college, even into adult education.
What kind of subjects did they highlight?
Things like geography, but focused on human culture and resources. The evolution of civilization, Western and global. American history, focusing on economic development and democracy. And significantly, a realistic study of contemporary America.
Realistic study, meaning?
Meaning looking at the problems, too. The inefficiencies, the injustices, not just the good stuff.
So a critical look at society. Were they open to different viewpoints?
They insisted on it. A thorough study of all major social theories, whether radical or conservative. They also wanted students to grasp the principle of continuity, how things connect and evolve over time.
And resources, what did they say about those?
Big emphasis on good libraries with diverse materials, and using the actual life of the school and the surrounding society as a core learning resource. Get kids out into the community.
Okay, so that's the what to teach. What about the how? Their ideas on teaching methods.
They saw method not just as tricks or techniques, but as a rational way of bringing together the student, the materials, and the learning situation.
To achieve what goals?
To help students understand people in society, develop their creative side, their self-direction, and basically induct them into this evolving democratic society.
Did they like the teaching methods they were seeing back then?
Not entirely. They were actually pretty critical of what they saw as too much faith in method divorced from knowledge, thought, and purpose.
Like focusing on how to teach without worrying enough about what you're teaching or why.
Exactly. They argued methodology is inseparable from the content. How you teach depends on what you're teaching.
Makes sense. What else affected teaching methods, in their view?
A lot of things. Child development, how materials are organized, grading, resources, the school's image, teacher training, supervision. They even said the community should be like an uncensored laboratory for the study of social life.
Uncensored laboratory, that's provocative.
It is. And they were quite concerned about teacher training, especially for social studies. They felt American teachers were generally poorly trained compared to Europeans in this area. They wanted teachers who understood the big picture, could connect with students' lives, go beyond textbooks.
Use imagination, integrate subjects.
Right. Use the community, tap into student interests, foster social impulses, deal with individual differences, use different teaching tools wisely, avoid jargon but still drill the basics, and crucially, foster independent study and critical thinking.
That's a tall order for a teacher. A very skilled facilitator, really.
Absolutely, not just a lecturer.
Okay, so we have the curriculum, the teaching method. What about assessment? How do they think schools should figure out if students were actually learning this stuff? Their views on tests and testing.
Yeah, this is fascinating, especially thinking about testing today. They saw testing and learning as connected, obviously. They noted the rise of these new forms of tests, objective tests, basically in the early 20th century.
Multiple choice, true, false, that kind of thing.
Right. But they had some serious reservations, especially for social sciences.
What about intelligence tests, IQ tests?
They were very skeptical. They questioned what those tests actually measured and warned against using them to make big social or educational policy decisions. They felt intelligence was tied up with social and cultural factors.
And tests of character.
Or culture.
Even more skepticism there. They doubted you could really put a number on ethical or aesthetic qualities. How do you quantify character?
Good question. What about tests measuring classroom learning? The objective tests.
They admitted these were probably the testing movement's biggest contribution for social sciences because they could check factual recall, basic understanding.
Now, there's a but coming, isn't there?
A big but. They saw major limits. These tests couldn't really measure long-term results or complex skills like analyzing different viewpoints or building a logical argument.
Things that are pretty crucial in social studies.
Exactly. And they listed specific perils of relying too heavily on them, like focusing only on academic scores, encouraging guessing, creating this false sense of certainty about what kids know.
So what was their final verdict on these new tests? Pretty damning, actually. They concluded that, except maybe as occasional checks, these new type tests do positive damage to the minds and powers of children.
Wow, positive damage.
Yeah. And they've said these tests were no substitute for older exams, like essays, or just the teacher's professional judgment. For them, the real test of social science education wasn't a paper and pencil score.
It was.
It was how individuals actually responded to social situations throughout their lives, how they acted as citizens.
That's a much broader and harder to measure definition of success.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
which ties back to the immense importance they placed on the teacher.
Right. The teacher was the keystone, they said. Given the critical times, they needed teachers with scholarship, courage, vision.
Exactly. And to get those teachers, they said you needed three things. Select gifted people in the first place, give them the right training, and provide supportive working conditions.
And their idea of the right training was different, wasn't it?
Radically different from just teaching techniques. They wanted teacher training focused on broad knowledge, deep thinking, guiding ideals. More like training an artist or a statesman, they suggested.
Your policeman, high standard.
It is. They really disliked the way teaching methods had become separated from actual social knowledge in teacher colleges. They called for a reunion, bring the subject experts and the pedagogy experts back together, focused on a shared social purpose.
How would that look, practically?
Fewer super specialized education courses, more solid general courses in the social sciences themselves, research seminars for teachers, fewer flimsy principles of education courses, maybe taught by actual scholars in history or economics.
And they wanted to break down the walls between different types of colleges.
Yes, abolish the divide between liberal arts colleges and the normal schools or teacher colleges, a unified system. Their ideal teacher was part of a profession that understood social welfare, was engaged in society, had academic freedom, and aimed for leadership.
A very empowered vision of the teaching profession.
Definitely. Which brings us to the context they operate in public relations and administration.
Right. Because the best program fails if the system around it doesn't support it.
Precisely. They knew schools face tons of pressure, internal and external. And often, the groups that win out are the ones trying to keep things the same,
Right.
protect their own advantages.
So school leaders need to be savvy.
Savvy and principled. They argued leaders need to understand society, act with independent judgment, not just be employees following orders. The whole teaching profession, they said, has a duty to act for the general good, not narrow interests.
What do they suggest for improving how schools relate to the public and how they're run?
Things like more representative school boards. A shift in administration away from just management toward actually facilitating good teaching. A unified teaching profession that could speak with one voice.
Protection for teachers, too, from pressure.
Crucial. Protection against undue pressure. They also noted that community was getting bigger because of technology, and interdependent schools serve the whole nation, really.
Which connects to funding, I guess.
Yes, they supported the trend of shifting school funding more to the state and national level. For fairness, for equal opportunity. They warned against budget cuts, closing schools, or rolling back free public education, called it a potential disaster.
Did they want a single national school system?
They saw dangers in that, potential for too much central control, but they thought more integration could happen through cooperation, through professional organizations working together.
And the role of the administrator, the principal or superintendent?
They needed to be more than just managers. They should be educational leaders, social philosophers, statesmen, even focused on the big picture, not just the technical stuff.
So pulling this all together, after this really fascinating deep dive into this 1934 report, what are the main takeaways?
Well, you have this influential commission envisioning a future America moving towards something they called collectivism, this more integrated society.
Right, a major shift away from pure individualism.
And their core belief that education had to change fundamentally to prepare citizens for that new reality, to ease that transition.
And they laid out incredibly detailed plans for how to do it. Curriculum, teaching, testing, the role of teachers, administration. It's a comprehensive blueprint.
It really is. It gives you this incredible window into how a group of leading thinkers nearly a century ago were grappling with huge social and economic changes and saw education as a key lever for shaping the future.
It definitely makes you think. Which leads us to the final question, really, for everyone listening. We've explored this report from 1934. What echoes do you hear today?
Do these ideas seem completely forgotten? Or are traces of this blueprint still visible in how schools are structured, what they aim to do now?
Yeah, that ongoing tension between, say, individual achievement and social responsibility in schools. Where does that balance lie? It's something this commission was wrestling with directly.
It certainly is. If listeners are intrigued, checking out the original report or parts of it offers a lot more food for thought.
Absolutely. It really makes you contemplate the long shadow these ideas might have cast, whether we always realize it or not, on American education.